There is no reason to expect reality to be rationally apprehendable. This is the basic fallacy, that we so confidently assume the world is for us that we assume that we should also therefore be able to understand it. When in fact what we've done is just carved out a very limited domain of repetitious algorithms that don't have fatal consequences for us, and then the rest of it lies in the realm of the great who knows. But, since there's very little percentage to be made out of that, people prefer to keep their faces turned inward toward the campfire, not outward toward the immense darkness revealed by the campfire. And the bigger you build the campfire of metaphor, the more darkness you reveal outside of its domain. So if ever there was an argument for open-endedness and a defocusing on closure, it would be the linguistic enterprise, I think.
Well, we couldn't just this one. It may, language may be the carrier or the virus that in fact causes consciousness. There may not be any consciousness without this infection of language.
Yeah, well, I don't have any trouble with that. I mean, William Burroughs said language is a virus from outer space. And well, it may be. It does have, it self-replicates itself. It spreads through a population. Ideas mutate. They compete with each other. Ideas become extinct. New ideological forms that are more adaptable squeeze out other forms. I mean, the whole evolution of organic life may be simply a lower dimensional rehearsal for a kind of syntactical evolution that is going to go on in a domain that we can barely conceive of. Yeah, over.
Yeah, for myself, I'm not so concerned with what the truth is, but what in fact works in one's life and how one uses the word or uses the ideas to manifest in the reality that we're swimming through. In light of that, I'm just wondering about the mushroom, morphogenetic fields, the plant community in terms of allies that one can become connected with as a collective community that we're all participating in. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I've talked with Rupert a lot about this, and different things can be said. I mean, one way of thinking about what the psychedelic experience is that psychoactive compounds amplify the morphogenetic field to the point where it becomes a potential object for inspection by the conscious mind. In the same way that we know right now that this room is filled with radio, VHF, UHF signals, but we also know that we would have to have a radio or a television set in order to tap into them. The morphogenetic field is ordinarily damped by experience, but becomes overwhelmingly present when we jack our neurophysiological receptors up to the point where these previously invisible influences become visible. The other thing in terms of the morphogenetic field theory and how it relates to psychedelics is to realize that when you take a plant, the plant takes you. And so, for instance, one of the reasons I prefer shamanic hallucinogens to synthetics is that they are so much richer as databases because they have inside them all the people who've ever taken them. I mean, when you take psilocybin, you leave something behind in there that every subsequent user of psilocybin will encounter. So you know the way Tibetans leave little cairns of rock when they cross high mountain passes? Well, this is what we're doing in the psychedelic experience. And really, the character of psilocybin is the cumulative superimposition of the character of the thousands and thousands of people over the millennia that have taken it, plus something else, its own unique nature. When you take a drug which induces an altered state like ketamine, for instance, ketamine is a drug that has not been around very long, hasn't been taken by millions of people, and is oddly empty. The building is there, the architecture is there, but where are the hurrying secretaries, the water coolers, the executives, the buzzing nothing. It's empty real estate. It's for rent. And if you want to move in, well, then you can live there. But it's the difference between a modern office building and a 14th century Italian villa when you contrast a modern synthetic with a well-used shamanic organic. Yeah.
Yes. Question. You bring up so many different questions. You sit here and kind of try to...
It's in order to be a moving target.
That's the idea. I'd like to relate an experience. Well, first of all, I'd like to kind of get some input from, if anybody else has anything to say on this matter. A lot of times when I first take like 5 grams or something, I get this is kind of a simple thing, but it's a yawn. I'm wondering does anybody else get that yawn? Yes.
No, the yawn is a physiological response to psilocybin that it's part of it.
Oh.
And so is the runny nose in the first hour. This is, every drug has a spectrum of effects, and some are dependable and some are not. I mean, for instance, LSD, you could almost say 100% of the people who take LSD, it dilates your eyes. That is an effect of LSD that it would be impossible to eliminate. But I wouldn't say 100% of the people who take LSD encounter the good Lord or something like that. That's a more selective effect.
Okay, the second part is, after I take 5 grams and after I get the buzzing sound in my ears, and then this last time I took it, was in a darkened room, laid on the bed, got naked, and just laid there. And for the first time, what happened, usually I close my eyes and I'm able to get visions, kind of a passing vision, almost like a film going through my head. I'm wondering also, does anybody get it where it's coming from the right to the left, or from the left to the right, sort of a film coming across?
Back to the front.
Terence, how about you?
Well, I think that the number of ways these things can present themselves is practically infinite. I mean, I've had really weird experiences with information. For instance, these flashers on buildings where the news goes by? I've had hallucinations where it became a textual hallucination. In other words, what I was seeing was an illuminated page of print, and then as I looked at it, every 50th letter would invert, and then suddenly every 20th, and then every 10th, and then every 5th, and I literally watch a page of text go from being readable to being gibberish, and then watch the meaning come through again in a loop. I mean, I think anything you can conceive of, it can do, and many things you can't conceive of.
That's the beauty of individual perception, though. I mean, we're all individuals. We all have the gift of bringing our own ideas.
But still, you have to be able to make general statements about it, or you would have to say that it's all and everything.
But if it was exactly the same, it would be boring.
Well, although how would you know, since you would never have any trip but your own?
Right.
One of the things that happens on psilocybin and on ayahuasca that really puzzles me, that I just go back to again and again, is you can be having these volleys of hallucination, and then you can say to it, Art Deco, and click, And suddenly there will be thousands of cigarette lighters, limousines, candy dishes, stuff rolling in black space in front of you. Thousands of these things perfectly exemplifying this very narrowly defined aesthetic domain. Italian Baroque. Click. Altarpieces, saints with their eyes rolled back, dripping gold, the whole thing. And so you say, boy, that is really strange. We click through aesthetic epochs like points on a dial, but then you can say to it, surprise me. In Baroque, not Empire, not dynastic Egypt, not North American Indian, Maya, or Fujiwara Japanese, but something never seen on this planet, but equally coherent as those other styles. And I always think, my God, if I could just grab hold of this, I would be Yves Saint Laurent or Klimt or somebody like that. And then, the most puzzling one of all is you can say to the mushroom, okay, enough of surprises, Art Deco, Italian Baroque, show me what you are for yourself. And then it's almost like, there's a roll of drums and black curtains begin to rise and there's a cold air that sweeps through the room and you realize, after about 45 seconds of that you have to call a halt because you realize, this thing had clothed itself in so many levels of visual reassurance for you as a human being that the request that it reveal its true nature sets off a cascade headed in a truly appalling direction. And usually you say, okay, that's enough of your true nature. Let's go back to dancing chipmunks and little candies rolling in the dark. Yeah.
Do you foresee thought, or discrete thought in particular, being locatable on the frequency spectrum of matter and energy such that it could drive the inputs of virtual reality so that you could communicate these kind of experiences with headsets?
You mean a machine that could be driven by the imagination? It raises a bunch of questions. I mean, the first question is, where is thought generated? The straight people believe that the brain makes thought, makes it. I think that the evidence is overwhelmingly against that's as naive an approach to thought as I remember when I was little. I once tore apart a radio looking for little people inside of it. And, there are no little people inside the radio. The radio transduces vibrations that surround the planet and turns it into a recognizable experience. I don't believe thought can be located in the brain. I think the brain is an amplifier and an antenna for something that is everywhere. That the phrase, my thoughts, is a complete misnomer. You don't own thoughts. You don't generate them. All you do is tune into an ocean of thought in which we're embedded. This is the morphogenetic field about which so much shouting and arm waving is going on. To my mind, the proof of this position is the fact that the psychedelic experience unleashes visions in your head which you could not possibly have conceived of or imagined. It doesn't come from you. If we say that the content of the psychedelic experience comes from the self, then we have defined the self in such a way that it's unrecognizable to us. And if your self is unrecognizable to you, then it isn't yourself, you see. So these things are proving that we participate in the world of mind, but that we don't generate it. Done.
In that case, how come they don't give us common experience then?
What?
Why aren't we all tripping the same thing if it's a universal thought?
Well, that's like saying when we swim in the ocean, why don't we all see the same fish? Because the ocean is enormous. Because we all enter it from different angles of attack.
But if we were
together, would we experience the same thing?
Yes, we would. And on psilocybin, one of the most stunning experiences you can have, if you wanted to make a believer out of you, is to sit with somebody and describe what you're seeing and agree that after 3 minutes you'll shut up and they'll start up, and you discover that you just hand the baton on. They see what you see what they see. This is confounding. You see, if we could do legal research with this stuff, we could overturn the paradigms of normal science in a number of areas within 18 months. I'm sure of it. I've seen it happen. I mean, I've seen states of group-mindedness that were so specific that there was no possibility that what was not happening was no shit, one-on-one, real-time telepathy.
Are there no countries in the world, maybe Amsterdam, or...
Well, there are countries in the world where psychedelic research is tolerated, is the only way to put it, but it's in the hands of scientists and people of the imagination impaired are largely in charge of these research programs. They're asking the wrong questions, you know. I mean, if you get well, that's enough. They're asking the wrong questions.
Something relevant to that. I wanted to share this with everybody else. I don't know if anybody's familiar with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They've just released their new newsletter, and what this newsletter says basically is that at a recent convened meeting with the FDA and a couple days after that with the National Institute for Drug Abuse, they've worked out an arrangement now where MDMA, at least, and they say in another article here that possibly LSD testing will be undertaken very seriously in the near future. And this is going through MAPS and in conjoint working with the FDA to get certain types of permits for the more intensive research that should be done in this field.
There is, I think, the resistance to psychedelic research is beginning to weaken because an entire generation of people who were, 3 and 4 years old in the 1960s, are now entering the medical research establishment as postdocs and so forth. And there is no good reason to be given for not having a research program on psilocybin, for example. I mean, it was never a social problem. It is a valid object for scientific research. It's amazing to me the gutlessness of the scientific establishment on this matter. I mean, why, we hear about the omnipotence of the AMA and so forth and so on. Why has the scientific establishment lain down like a dog and let politicians set the research agenda for human research on psychedelics? The last time this happened was in the 14th century when the Pope and his cronies tried to make it impossible for people to dissect corpses because they didn't want people to understand human anatomy. Well, in that situation, instead of swallowing it and putting up with it, medical students would steal bodies off the gallows and trail along behind armies to look at the freshly killed in order to create a compendious understanding of human anatomy. And they did. In the 20th century, science, which would have you believe that it's absolutely unbiased and it goes wherever curiosity seeks without prejudice or deference to anybody's social values or anything, is in fact a sycophantic slave to the agenda of these frightened politicians. So it's a real disgrace because, I lived through the first psychedelic revolution, and the news about LSD swept over the psychoanalytic community with the kind of force that the splitting of the atom swept over the physics community. And people involved in treating mental illness and studying brain function and mapping the brain said, this is amazing. A tool has been put into our hands that will throw open doorways in the practice of psychology we couldn't dream of. And instead, it was absolutely slammed shut. imagine if Galileo had smashed his telescope after there was a little bit of whining from the Vatican. Had that happened, we would still be living in a universe defined by the Aristotelian stellar shells. A little courage on the part of these almighty scientists would go a long way toward overwhelming the fearful strictures placed on by politicians who are trying to maintain a social equilibrium that is fairly odious anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of supported one thing you said, and also a question which I hope will be organized enough for you to answer. Your remarks about the telepathy after some extremely intense boundary dissolution experiences with my wife, we have gotten to the point where using straight Michael Harner shamanic journeying techniques, we routinely have each other's visions. I'm wondering if it isn't as much a matter of a learned response as anything else.
No, I think it is a learned response. I think, it requires psychedelics usually to plow the channel. But once you open the groove, then there are ways to reinforce it. And one of the underrated tools in this game is the power of acoustical driving and the power of sound to synergize subtle chemical reactions. I mean, music is so compelling to us because it is essentially brain massage of some sort, and the pleasure we derive from music is, at some level, a chemical pleasure. And I think, trying to get to these places with yoga and drumming and fasting and all that is a pretty thankless task unless you clear the way with psychedelics, and then you can really get somewhere. If you use psychedelics in combination with any of these traditional techniques for working in these areas, suddenly these traditional techniques, previously found to be maddeningly ineffective, become very, very powerful tools. So mantra with psychedelics works like magic. Yoga, breath control, drumming, visualization, simple prayer, it all works amazingly well in the presence of psychedelics. And in the absence of psychedelics entirely, it's a pretty frustrating get-go. And unfortunately, these non-psychedelic spiritual techniques are very quickly co-opted by the beady-eyed priests among us, who then peddle it back to us with a menu of moral do's and don'ts stapled to the front of it, and that's entirely discouraging.